Some people learn very fast. Others, not so much. I used to be in the second camp. Felt like I was always starting from behind and having to work harder than everybody else in order to just catch up. I'm probably dyslexic. Reading homework took me hours longer than it was supposed to. I had horrible hand-eye coordination until I played ice hockey 5 days a week. I had a speech impediment until I was 12 years old and I almost failed Spanish in college. Now I'm trilingual, I was an accent coach, I read several books a month, I'm a pretty damn good social dancer, and I'm accomplished in my career. There is a process to getting good, learning fast, and becoming that asshole who's never picked up a guitar before but learns the riff from Stairway to Heaven in a weekend.
Hey! No stairway. Denied.
The first thing to do is to go meta and understand what a skill actually is. At its most basic level, a skill is a trained response to a specific stimulus in order to achieve a goal. When my goal is to hand set in volleyball, my brain has to tell my hands which position to start in. That position has to adjust dependent on where the volleyball is in space. That is a skill related to my hands in hand setting in beach volleyball, but there is also the skill related to my body angle. There's a skill related to my eyes and being able to track the ball and understand where it's going to go. There's a skill related to my feet in order to run through the sand, which is pretty damn hard, in order to get to the exact correct position that my eyes tracked and decided that I needed to get to. So that's what a skill is. The next step is to understand what causes a skill to develop. It doesn't matter if you're learning pickleball or poetry, the mechanical process related to developing the skill is exactly the same. The better you understand this process, the more you can design it into your practice sessions. So what is this process? My favorite description actually comes from the book The Talent Code, written by Daniel Coyle. This is the cover, the book is downstairs. Our brain is full of neurons. These neurons are connected in ways that are continually changing. When you learn a new skill, what's mechanically happening is your brain is actually forging new connections between these neurons. As you improve in this skill, these connections thicken through a process of myelination. Myelin is like an electrical signal that speeds up the connection between neurons. These connections represent the pattern recognition we explained above. I see the volleyball flying through space. My eyes recognize where my body needs to be in order to make the perfect set. The more you practice a skill, the stronger and faster these neural connections get until they become seemingly automatic. If you look at the brain of an expert, you'll notice very thick myelination in specific areas of the brain that are related to their discipline. If we want to get good, aka learn quickly, we have to find techniques that strengthen this myelin. We do that by designing for skill development. The biggest mistake I made when I was trying to learn new things was I looked at everything in isolation. When I wanted to get better at salsa, I went to a salsa class. I studied salsa teachers. I tried to watch a sequence and learn that sequence. When I tried to get better at surfing, I researched the best techniques for learning how to pop up. I never took the time to question how I was setting myself up to learn the specific skill that I was working on. What was my goal? Was I studying the right materials in order to achieve this goal? What did my practice look like? Was I practicing enough? How did I know if I was getting better? I didn't have answers to these questions, and as a result, I didn't get as good as I could have in these various hobbies. So I'm going to go through these questions one by one and explain why each is so important when it comes to skill development. Question number one is, what is my goal? Now, this is obvious when we look at it, but surprising how few people have actual real goals for their learning projects or for their hobbies. If you don't have a goal, you don't have anything to measure towards, and you don't have a timeline to motivate you to do the work. I use the SMART goal system with my clients just because it checks all the boxes, but any goal system that you have that's specific, measurable, and time-bound will work. The next question to ask yourself is, am I studying the right materials? Tim Ferriss, the author of the 4-Hour Workweek, 4-Hour Chef, has the quote, "Materials beat method." What you study is so much more important than how you study it. Again, this sounds obvious, but again, you'd be surprised how often it is where people are studying materials that are only partially related to their goals. An easy example that you probably have all been through is language learning. Most people who have a goal of learning to speak a new language spend the majority of their time learning how to read, learning how to write perfectly, grammar tables. They'll join a class where Maybe years in, they attempt to speak, and spoiler alert, they can't do it. Why? Because they want to learn how to speak the language, but they never actually practice speaking the language. If you break down the skill of speaking, it goes down into pronunciation, understanding, comprehension, and vocabulary, having the right vocabulary for what you want to say, not having perfect grammar. So ask yourself, am I studying the materials that directly relate to my goal? The next question you want to ask is, how am I practicing? You could have a great goal, the right materials in order to achieve that goal, but not be making any progress because your practice sucks. This is where we start to apply the techniques to strengthen myelin. The most common problem that I see with practice is that people really don't have a structure for their practice sessions. They try to practice too many skills at once and they don't see any progress. To fix this, you want to set up a goal for your practice session before you start the practice session. Break down the skill that you want to achieve into the smallest possible parts and then make sure that you can perform each of those parts in isolation. Then start to combine them part by part into the sequence, but don't do the full sequence at once. Here you could see where the weak part in the chain is, and you can focus on that for the practice session. There are many other ways to get better practice. If you'd like to see more videos about that, please comment below. Let me know what you're practicing. The next question is, are you practicing enough? More practice is not necessarily better practice, but pros practice often. Well, most of them do.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice. I mean, listen, we're talking about practice. Not a game. We're talking about practice.
To understand how much practice is enough practice, we need to go into the concept of the forgetting curve and short-term memory. And again, I'll try to use an example that everyone can relate to in order to illustrate this concept. Remembering someone's name. When you meet a new person, they're likely to say their name once and never again. And you'll quickly think about something else and forget their name. That's because the name didn't transfer into your long-term memory. You had one chance to remember their name. Time passed, that one chance wasn't enough, and it didn't encode into long-term. Let's compare that to another example. You meet a new person, they say their name to you. 1 minute later, you have to introduce that person to somebody else right next to you. 5 minutes later, you have to introduce that person to another person right next to you. 10 minutes later, or maybe even an hour later, you have to introduce that person that you met an hour ago to another person. How likely are you to remember that person's name? Very likely. Why? The first answer is repetition. You got more repetitions in order to remember that person's name and code it into long-term memory. The second answer is honestly because you had to use it. You had to remember that person's name, go in and retrieve that name and present it to somebody else. But the concept that we're talking about here is the forgetting curve. And what that is you had 1 minute between the initial introduction and the time that you had to remember that person's name. That 1 minute passed. It wasn't too long for you to forget that person's name. Then you had 5 minutes. If it was 30 minutes, maybe you would have forgotten that person's name already, but because it's 5, you can then go back into your memory. Okay, 5 minutes ago, I remember, or I heard that person's name, and now I can retrieve it and do it again. And then you go into 30 and an hour. You might even go back in a week later and still remember that person's name because you had enough repetitions at the right times in order to encode it into long-term memory. Now, how does this relate to developing a skill? Let's think learning piano. If you're a beginner, you need more repetitions closer together in order for a skill to sink in. This is because you're building that connection in between neurons and strengthening the myelin in between those two. If you're intermediate and you're learning a new song or a new technique, you're still going to need more repetitions close to each other in order to perfect that, because again, you're creating that connection. If you're advanced and you're practicing a technique that you learned in the past, or a song that you learned in the past, or even if you're intermediate and you're practicing something that you already learned, you don't need to practice those sessions, or you don't need to put those sessions as close together because you've already built that connection. That myelin exists, you're just going back in and re-insulating and re-strengthening that so that it doesn't move from your long-term memory to something that's been forgotten. Interestingly enough, masters generally practice more than beginners do, but they also mix their practice. So they're practicing new skills and abilities, and they're staying at the edge of their ability, which is the perfect zone for myelin development. The last question you want to focus on is, how do you know if you're getting better? It's hard to underemphasize the importance of feedback in skill development. Practice doesn't make perfect, it makes permanent. If you don't get feedback while you're practicing, you will develop the wrong technique, and then it will become much more difficult to undevelop that technique. Anders Ericsson is one of the godfathers of performance science, and he makes the argument in his book Peak that one of the most important differences between people who get good and people who don't is the first group's ability to understand their mistakes. So knowing this, how do we get feedback? I've talked about this in a couple videos already, but there's 3 major steps that you want to take in order to get feedback. The first step is to record yourself, whatever that means for you and for your skill. That could be game film, that could be taking a screen recording of you learning a new software, or taking a test on the subject that you're trying to study. The next step is to measure what you're doing. You want to create objective measurements based off of your game film. So if you look at your game film, how many turnovers do you have? How many bad passes, for example? If you look at your screen recording, how many errors are you making during the process of trying to complete a process in the software that you're learning? If you're a complete beginner and you don't know what correct looks like, that has to be the first step. So my advice would be to hire a coach or someone who's just a little bit further along in this skill than you are, and have them look at your game film with you. If that's not an option, YouTube is a great resource for coaches teaching skills or experts performing skills. Watch YouTube videos of the skill that you're trying to develop and see what the experts say is important. What is the proper technique? And then use that to codify your measurement system so that you can measure exactly what you're doing as compared to the perfect way of doing things. The last thing that I want to say for this video is that even if you have all of these things, you still may plateau. Even if you start with a goal, you have good materials to fit that goal, you design good practice sessions, you're practicing enough, and you have a good feedback system, you might get stuck just because these things will need to change throughout the life cycle of a skill or the life cycle of developing mastery. If you feel stuck in your learning or your skill development and want to work with me one-on-one, I actually have a program directly related to this concept of being stuck. It's only $97 at the time of this recording. I'll leave a link down below if you want to learn more about that. If not, that's fine. I will still leave a link to the questions that I go through with each client to identify where they're stuck. These questions are related to the 5 questions that we answered in this video. What are your goals for what you're learning? Are you using the right materials? How do you drill or practice? How often do you drill or practice? And what is your feedback system? And is it a good and effective system of feedback? Each of these is going to be weighted differently depending on what part of the learning process or the mastery process you are in. In the beginner and lower intermediate phase of mastery, the feedback and materials are much more important than everything else. This has to do with what we talked about with Anders Ericsson. You don't really know what you're doing. So if you obsess over volume at this stage, you could end up training the wrong thing, doing things incorrectly. If you're at the intermediate or higher intermediate or advanced stage, a lot of the times volume becomes more important because you've already conceptually mastered how you're supposed to do a specific skill, and it just becomes about when are you doing it, how often are you doing it. Drilling becomes really important to make sure that you're breaking things down correctly. Material is important throughout because you can't practice or get better if you don't know what's actually holding you back. I made several videos on the plateau and how to get unstuck. I'll leave a link to those right here. And otherwise, that's all for now. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.